So we just got back. We saw this about 24 hours ago, so it's had a little bit of time to sink in.
That's right.
Obviously, sequel to the critically acclaimed The Shining.
A movie everyone loves.
Everyone loves, to varying degrees. Stephen King wrote a sequel novel to The Shining in 2013. It was optioned by Warner Brothers, who made the original Shining. And now directed by Mike Flanagan of the House on Haunted Hill fame, which I have not seen because I do not care.
Yep.
So...
Although people say it's a very well put together horror, almost like instant horror classic, unlike Doctor Sleep. So, yeah.
I spread my net wide with this one, wider than I normally do in terms of like idiot reviewers and non-idiot reviewers, because I really wanted to see what people thought about this film.
What I personally enjoyed so much about some of the positive reviews is that they all said the same thing, and the same thing was so sycophantic and like missed the goalposts by just like such a wide margin. They all said it's this excellent, you know, they said it was this great marriage between the Stephen King vision for the Shining book and the sequel book Doctor Sleep, and also the Stanley Kubrick movie The Shining, and never has a more untrue statement been issued in such a widespread manner on a film, in my opinion. I think it's really entertaining.
Yeah, I would personally like to offer every person who said that a duel.
Yeah.
We'll work from there.
We're gonna tell you what we think of the movie and if we recommend, and then we're gonna go into some wider context.
I mean, as you might gather from the fact I'm willing to duel people who sycophantically praise this movie, I was not its biggest fan.
Yeah.
However, in a twist, I would probably still recommend you go see it. I think it's, especially if you like The Shining, worthy of consideration. I don't think it's unlikely that someone could really like it, and I would disagree with you, but I think it's worth watching. I think it's more so than most of these cash-ins. It is, maybe don't watch it in the cinema if you get bored in the cinema. It's 2.5 hours long and it feels every minute.
It's an absurd runtime. So not only would I say watch it, it all depends on your kind of general disposition. I would recommend that someone see this in the cinema because I thought it was so entertaining. Now, I need to be clear in that this is a bad movie that fails in several ways, but also it's just so batshit, and it's even fun. See, we've done these soft reboots before, and they're quite tedious, and we did one last week, you know, this new Terminator movie where they do these really hollow callbacks to classics that you love to try and get you to like this new movie, and you never do, and it's always a very tedious experience. Now, Doctor Sleep has that same problem, but the road that led to its creation is so much more fraught, and it involves a real auteur, you know, Stanley Kubrick. It's not like it's trying to ape, I don't know, like, no disrespect, but like George Lucas or a James Cameron sci-fi movie, that it creates this perfect storm of high art and vandalism and banal Stephen King-isms, and I was elated when we left it because it was a really unique fuck-up, and that's my advert for Doctor Sleep.
It's a full fucking swing. I'll give them that. Like, any addendum to that is that Ewan McGregor is great. If he'd done this performance in a different film and that wasn't trying to be a sequel to The Shining and had none of that attached, I think it'd be probably one of the better horror film performances I've ever seen.
You know what? If you are a millennial, you grew up with Ewan McGregor. Even if you didn't realise it, mate, you're jonesing for some Ewan McGregor back on screen, and that was kind of largely what motivated me to see this. And you said so as well. It was like, great. Ewan McGregor is back in movies. His affair is over. The divorce is settled. Yep. He's alone. He needs cash. We're going to see him in some blockbusters.
I mean, like, fuck, man. If you'd approached me, like, you know, even 5 years ago and said Ewan McGregor's going to play the fucking kid from The Shining, which I didn't realise until the day that I saw the film, and that was deeply upsetting. I've accepted it now. That's as much as you're getting for Doctor Sleep for us for now. I will put in the timestamp when we start talking about Doctor Sleep again. If you're only interested in Doctor Sleep, we'll discuss this.
It will be in the description.
We will get down to talking about The Shining. So if you're interested in The Shining, then feel free to keep on listening, because I think this is a fascinating production story. And again, there's just a lot to unpack on all four mediums or four pieces of art that this touches. So you've got The Shining the film, The Shining the book, Doctor Sleep the film, Doctor Sleep the book, and the two men behind them all. What is your opinion on The Shining?
It embodies Kubrick's ability. In this case, The Shining is both a completely functional, mysterious horror movie, and then also reaches some quite lofty aspirations with regards to subtext. He never ever hits you over the head with that subtext. He just doesn't do it. I think it's really impressive that the movie can survive without its subtext. So yeah, it's both high art Kubrick complex piece of cinema and also just a fun, scary, unsettling horror movie. And that's what I think is the real magic of that Stanley Kubrick movie.
I definitely like it less than you do. I think it's good. I think at moments it really hits greatness, and I think overall it's one of the more engaging horror films I've ever seen. But I don't know, something about it, and I don't know if it was that start off in the Stephen King base, even though he did abandon like loads of it. Like something never quite sat right with me about it. And bearing again, I haven't seen it for a long time, like probably since I was like 21, 22. And like you said, you said before we started recording, like as a teenager you were not as keen on it. So I wonder if perhaps I was still in that stage. Something about it. Like I've always obviously appreciated it as iconic. I think it's really like I did really like all the performances, everything about it. But for some reason it was never this sort of like instant classic masterpiece that like people like the amount of reviews I've listened to about Doctor Sleep, right, where the reviewer says The Shining is their favorite film ever is quite incredible.
Disingenuous, I think.
It must be. I mean, it's not. By the way, it's not in my top 10 or my top 20 or anything. I just think it's a really excellent movie. But and even if you said it was in your top 5 films, I'd still respect that. But that's what I mean. Like it's just the sheer volume of people, and again, people do this with all the Kubrick films, rightly or wrongly. He will get put on this weird pedestal that, like, just sometimes I don't think is really there in the film itself. There are people, again, like, there's fucking one reviewer guy who said he watches The Shining every 3 months. And I was like, that's insane. Like, fuck that guy.
I tell you what, no, I will say this. This is the other thing that I really like about The Shining, though, and it links in kind of with the sycophants, but more importantly, it links in with the psychopaths. Because The Shining has a special effect on people where it attracts maniacs and makes them think that they're seeing things in the movie that aren't there. And that, again, is a weird allure of Stanley Kubrick. And this is codified and proved in a documentary movie called Room 237.
I actually watched most of that today. Yeah, well, it
Did
worked.
you?
But yeah, no, I watched most of it. Fucking insane.
That's exactly.
The fucking, like, as soon as he, like, fucking, the guy starts talking about the fucking Holocaust. And he's like, oh, the number 42 is very important. And the typewriter. The German typewriter in number 42 is very important because that means they decided to do the Holocaust. The fuck are you talking about?
See, this is the thing is that I believe that the movie has something to do with, or at least leaves the door open for having something to do with Native American supernatural revenge. I do believe that, but everything else, that's the most legitimate thing that they have in Room 237. But Room 237 was a very well-reviewed movie in at least England, and then I threw it on one night. I was fucking bevved up. It was like 20 minutes in, the penny dropped, and I was like, these people are fucking crazy. And they talk about how when someone goes to shake Jack's hand, there's a file of papers behind the guy that looks for a moment like an erection, and it doesn't. It's just a line. And then, like you say, they say it's some kind of admission that you faked the moon landing because Danny Torrance has an Apollo 11 jumper on. And it's just like...
There's also the fact he changed the room number is the other one, isn't it? Yeah, so he changed it from 217 to 237 because sometimes, not always, but sometimes the distance from the moon is 237,000 kilometers.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's 2040 because you know what? The moon moves a lot.
Do you want to know what else? Do you want to know why it's that room number? Because the lodge they filmed it in, they wanted it to be a fake room number. They didn't want it to be the number that was in, I believe, in the novel, because they thought it would deter visitors.
Yeah, of course.
And the irony is that actually the fake number is the one that everyone requests. And as well with the Apollo 11 thing, within their conspiracy theories, there is actually a much more plausible explanation, which is that I appreciate that nothing gets into a Stanley Kubrick movie without meaning something. So let's say that the jumper means something. And in this situation, if it's about, if there's a subtext regarding Native Americans, then the Apollo 11 is surely just about boundary breaking, frontiers, and manifest destiny. It's not that he faked the moon landing.
No, definitely. It was
fucking psychos.
That was fucking mad. I had no idea, because I was doing some research. And again, I assume none of the stuff I'm going to say in this review is anything that people haven't come up with before. Like, it's a couple of days worth of Shining research, whereas I'm sure people have been thinking about this film for decades.
Yes.
But I was like, oh, look, there's a documentary. Some people seem to like it. You know what actually made me decide to put it on in the end was the fact that Stephen King hated it. I was like, perfect. Anything that Stephen King hates is a friend of mine. But lo and behold, sometimes the enemy of your enemy is not your friend. Is a violent psychopath with his dick out. You shouldn't go around his house.
As a closer on Room 237, I would highly recommend watching it just to substantiate what I've said, because I do think that there's just something about the weird repeating hexagonal patterns in The Shining that attracts a certain kind of loony and just makes them think that the movie's speaking to them, and that they're fucking nuts.
They're mad. I genuinely don't believe what I saw, and I would recommend that as well. I'd recommend that before you watch fucking Doctor Sleep, actually. So yeah, The Shining. Again, a strange confluence. Stanley Kubrick had no real attachment to the book, as far as I can tell, having listened to the interviews. Like, he just picked it up. He was randomly going through books. He then really, like, dug the vibe of the book, but again, found aspects of it to be highly suspect. And one of the reasons he always loved to adapt books is because he got to read it as an audience member and then, much like we do, propose edits to it. But unlike us, he was a incredibly successful and intelligent filmmaker and thus managed to make good films off the back of that. That's a great system, and it means that, unfortunately for Stephen King, he doesn't need to necessarily respect everything in the book that he's adapting.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally think that nearly everything The Shining does that's different from the book is better than what's in the book, from my understanding of the book, and I assume you'll agree. Yeah.
No, I do. I mean, the situation is perfectly simple. Full respect extended to Stephen King, because he writes some great stories that I have really enjoyed. They're adaptations, and that has to come from somewhere. But he's also kind of he's like a pulp writer. He just writes until he slumps over his typewriter. He's like fucking L. Ron Hubbard. As much as he might rate The Shining, I'm afraid to some of us it really is a lot of his work. It is disposable. And for that reason, when someone like Stanley Kubrick comes and picks it up, listen, I'm afraid, some harsh truths. He's a different kind of artist, and he is going to hack liberally at what he finds. Stephen King was not a fan of that at all, and he's been so bitter about it that he remade The Shining as a terrible TV series. He's been rallying against it for ages, but then also conversely says that while he disliked what he'd done to his book in the adaptation, separate to that, it's a horror movie he enjoys. He's been very contradictory on this subject.
Agreed. Well, I think it's because he really enjoys the prestige of having his name in next to, a Kubrick film that is The Shining, but he also is really annoyed because, and again, I was looking into this, so one of the really interesting things he said about Doctor Sleep, the book, and then consequently the film, was that he said it's the true story, the true history of the Torrance family. So I think what would happen, and I can kind of understand this, I would be annoyed if the definitive versions of my characters were something that I hadn't made and didn't like. And I can imagine that would really grate at me, and if I was a petty man, I might make a sequel and push for a film about the sequel to try and correct some of those things.
This is the seed. This is kind of where the strange hilarity of Doctor Sleep, the movie adaptation, makes birth, and it's in Stephen King's inability to reconcile the fact that his story is famous because of the changes that someone else made to it.
As a quick thing, Stephen King said in an interview that I watched earlier today that Stanley Kubrick thought too much and felt too little. And in response, I say that Stephen King feels too much and thinks nothing at all. Like, it's fucking ridiculous. Like, how bloody dare that man. So yeah, Doctor Sleep. So Doctor Sleep is a classic example of feeling, and it's basically feeling entitled to the characters that you made. Obviously, like I said, there's a number of differences, and this film is stuck in, ironically almost for a Stephen King book, is stuck in this horrible limbo between two authorial sources of which cannot agree with one another. It's a child of divorce. But they're both grinning around the table as it happens.
That's the really peculiar thing about it, is that it pretends
everything's fine.
It runs to one parent and says that that's the one they're devoted to, and then it sneaks into the room with the other parent, being dead Stanley Kubrick, and declares its unending devotion. Not only its unending devotion to Kubrick, but also like slanders Stephen King when he's not listening. It's really, really funny.
Yeah, because it claims to be in the same universe as the cinematic universe as The Shining, which is a terrible sentence that I had to utter.
Yes,
it doesn't make me happy at all. And
makes me quite happy.
And it reports that, and the reason it does is in some sort of weird cultural imperialism on the characters of The Shining. It removes any and all nuance from The Shining, and because you were never sure in The Shining what was going on.
Yeah.
To quote Reservoir Dogs, you're not sure who's alive, not sure who's dead, not sure who's caught, not sure who's not. Like you got no idea what's going on,
Nice.
and it's really beautiful that you don't have a set POV and you don't know what's going on. This film answers everything, and it does so without any fanfare, and it does so in the way that Stephen King wanted it, and that's fine. But I think that was almost the entire purpose of this film adaptation, was to let Stephen King have the last laugh on these characters, on the Jack Nicholson character, on the Danny as he appears in the film, and Shelley Duvall. And again, and I think that's why they focus so heavily, because again, Stanley Kubrick famously did not believe in heaven, hell, or God. Stephen King famously believes in all three and more. And I think that he really wanted to show and prove that not only were the ghosts real, but that there were many more ghosts, and that there was actually an afterlife, and that has now been irreparably stapled on the end of The Shining, like a albatross around its neck.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that he summed it up very, very well. I can't tell you exactly why, but the fact that this is such an embarrassing younger brother to The Shining doesn't hurt or disappoint me. I just find it really funny, just because as a sibling that you want to keep locked in the attic, its antics are so hysterical and so different to what you're used to seeing in the movie that it constantly evokes, that I just can't help but find it very, very interesting. So I think I'll start with a few things. Obviously it has the visuals of The Shining, and I will say that I like the way this movie looks. It's very dark, but it's also very colourful. Its characterization is all over the place, only in a way that, you know, it's an adaptation of a strange novel that has been rewritten because the first draft was so bad. That was in 2014 with, who was it?
Kiva Goldsman,
There you go.
a man whose career I've been following dutifully. He is an Oscar winner and a like quintuple nominated Golden Raspberry screenwriter. His life is an anathema, and I hate him. He wrote A Beautiful Mind, but he also wrote real terrible episodes of the new Titans TV show and just loads of shit. I could do an entire bloody episode on Akiva Goldsman. Truly ridiculous. So he wrote that. It was so unpopular that no one would touch what was probably going to be the hottest horror film of any given year that it was released in. But then It did really well, the two It films that have just come out, and that was Warner Brothers' highest banking horror film of that year, and so as such, they got someone in to rewrite that terrible Doctor Sleep script that's been banging around for a couple of years, and that guy was Mike Flanagan. He had the unenviable task, quite frankly, of managing this, divorcee child, and I think he did pretty well considering. I don't think anyone could have done it better, frankly. That's some praise, right?
I mean, it's got the Kingian hallmarks. It's got alcoholism. It's got signposts to a better story all over the place. I'd like to pick up on something. I want to just talk broadly about the characterization. Essentially, in the novel itself, I mean, Danny is Dr. Sleep in that he works in a hospice and he gives comfort using The Shining to people who are about to die. And the antagonists in the movie are trying to avoid death for as long as possible at the expense of children with The Shining who they kind of harvest and eat, and it's very horrific. Now that's an interesting kind of dichotomy that you have going on there, which is spoiled by King himself. Like, he always falls upon his own sword because, and I was saying to you, in the first scene where he comforts a man who's dying, he explains to him not to worry because it will be like going to sleep forever and it will be true rest, which I thought worked because that worked with his character being the one about the acceptance of death. However, this is a ghost story, and later he tells them all not to worry because life does go on, and no one's ever really gone, which really invalidates it. It sucks the tension out of the bad guys, because I kind of liked what motivated them. They wanted to avoid annihilation. However, we're in a story where annihilation doesn't happen, and they didn't establish whether or not their attempts to extend their life had actually thwarted any chance of an afterlife, which again might have been an idea.
That might have been fun. That might have added some tension to the stakes. That would have, maybe some, something poetic in their strive for life had removed eternal life from them. That might have been nice, but Stephen King didn't think of that. He's a fucking hack.
No, exactly. and then further, I mean, so there's a character who's called a Snakebite Andy, and she's introduced early on as being a 15-year-old who entraps paedophiles because she hates them. And her character starts with hating adult men, presumably for their perversions, and then ends before, spoilers, she dies by saying men and angrily making a man shoot himself. However, it doesn't make any sense because she uses her powers to punish paedophiles. Obviously, this is because they hurt children, and yet immediately joins a coven where immortality, or something close to immortality, comes at the cost of killing and eating children, and this is never reflected upon.
Yeah, I can actually explain that dissonance. It doesn't excuse it, but I can explain it.
Please do.
So in the book, she doesn't. I don't know if she traps pedophiles or not, but her hatred for men isn't because they're pedophiles, it's because they're men. And she doesn't like men in that typical sort of like very direct Kingsian fashion because she was abused as a child by a man, by her father. And so her mission in life is to hurt men, and she is a lesbian who sleeps with what's she called, Mac the Hat or whatever.
Yes.
Rose the Hat, and
she was very protective of that hat, and we never found out why.
No, and apparently Stephen King was very specific in what the hat's design should be for the film, and for no actual reason. And that's the sort of weird like micro detail he obsesses about that makes his books have the sort of appearance of depth. And sometimes, like you said, if you read into it, actual depth. Like there's some lovely scenes in this that flesh out the world, but never enough to actually make the film you're watching, actually enjoyable. That's why. So that got a bit lost in translation. So they obviously, they really focused on the paedophile part, and I did think it was really funny that she was so against people wanting to have sex with children, but perfectly fine with not only the murder, the excruciating torture before murder.
Making sure the murders last as long as possible.
Yeah, absolutely ridiculous. But yeah, so that's why. So that character got slightly. All of the coven, as I will call them, because I'm not going to call them the True Knot, because the film doesn't call them the True Knot, as far as I'm aware. So why should I?
I had cannoned them as the pedo coven.
Oh yeah, that works. But yeah, the coven it's clearly changed a bit, and I think it had to change. It has to change from the novel because they're really dumb in the novel.
They kept the characterization of people's sort of like death juice as being called steam, and described children as being steamy, like steamy kids. Bring me those steamy kids. This was another problem I had with it, Aaron. It's like, can we centralize the fucking names, please, Stephen? Because Danny's like, I always called it The Shining. The kid's like, I call it my magic trick, and they're just like, we call it the Steam.
Yeah, because in the Shining, it makes sense that you don't know what it's called, because again, in the film The Shining, everything's really vague, and he calls his imaginary friend Tony, which again, in some dumbass Stephen King shit, as I found out today, Tony in the book is actually just Danny from the future, trying to warn Danny from the past about his father, his crazy ass father, and the hotel, which again, not only makes no sense, but actively devalues it. Also, he's just really ineffective, as far as I can tell.
Yes.
Like, if that's what he's actually trying to do, he's really fucking up. There's like a plurality of different people, different names, and the coven is sort of, it's given what feels like just hours of development in the film, and for very little purpose.
It goes nowhere.
I think we've probably already spoiled the film several times over at this point, but spoilers again. Like, everyone dies in a shootout, and that's actually a really funny part of the film, and almost like a really good part of the film, because you're fighting like this. Imagine the scene: you're fighting this evil vampire coven with psychic powers. It's like, oh, what are we gonna do? I know. We'll make a kill zone and just snipe them all.
They just shoot at them with normal guns.
Yeah, just two hunting rifles. Works so well.
That marked it worked perfectly.
They killed like fucking thousands of years of collective experience in like a couple of seconds
by standing behind trees and shooting.
It's a miracle. Like, between that and how Crowboy dies, it's a miracle that they lived through the Roman Empire. Like, how the fuck did they pull that off?
I'm gonna say that this actually marked the last point in the movie where, of all the bad things I'm saying about it, it was quite entertaining. Not that it was good, but it was entertaining because it was very like Sci-Fi Channel. It was like a weird episode of the X-Files, and I kind of enjoyed that, even though I knew that it would inevitably be consumed by Shining nostalgia. But after that scene was when the filmmakers and all of the conversations that it had in rooms that Stephen King wasn't in came to fruition, and they were like, we need to go back to the Overlook. Now, it's important to note that the Overlook Hotel in the book is burned down and destroyed prior to Doctor Sleep, and the final act of Doctor Sleep, the novel, occurs on the grounds where the Overlook used to be. However, in this, they did a strange and pathetic gambit in which we returned to the actual hotel, which was full of some of the funniest moments in a movie I've seen all year, like almost clap-worthy, if that wouldn't have been a very strange thing to do, because I think I was having quite a singular experience.
I tried not to laugh for the entire last fifth of this film.
The way that they paid the piper, they paid Stephen King for their blasphemous return into Kubrick territory, is that they did blow up the Overlook Hotel to complete his vision. The circle is now complete, and that fucking whiny little ex-cokehead got what he wanted.
He's such a piece of shit. I cannot imagine. Like, how old is Stephen King? He's like 70-something, right?
Old as fuck, yeah.
He's 70-something, like you said, he's a fucking ex-cokehead, ex-fucking alcoholic. Man got hit by a fucking van and has written more books than I have fucking bones in my body. And yet, the man cares enough about a book he probably spent like 2 cocaine sessions writing in the 80s, that he was willing to fight, to help create a multi-million-pound project just so he could burn down a fictional hotel.
Yeah.
Fucking madness. This is the worst excesses of capitalism.
I know it's annoying, but we can't cover this enough, because this movie exists. Stephen King needed it to happen because he wanted to.
Which he failed, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. But the only reason that anyone was ever going to adapt a 2013 Stephen King novel that no one fucking read is because of Kubrick's movie, and by sneaking in, Trojan horsing in a Kubrick sequel.
Begging Stephen King. He's like, please let us use the hotel, Steve. Stephen. It's the only thing anyone cares about.
It's the only way.
If we don't have the hotel, I'll just use all the scenes, but in not a hotel. Because no one else is going to see this otherwise. We need something to put in the trailer, Steve.
Yeah, we need him to walk up to that door. No, he's going to do it, Stephen. No, he's not. No one will see it if he doesn't walk up to the door, Stephen.
Stephen, I've got two graphs. One is a flat line, and it's how many people will see this if he doesn't walk up to the door. And one is really spiky and big, and it's made of green money. And it's what happens if he walks up to the door.
The movie's been bombing, by the way. That is the funny part.
Oh,
yeah.
Is it? Oh, shit. I assumed it was going to do really... it's like bloody Blade Runner 2049 all over again. Because like these sequels was to prestige 80s projects just don't do well.
Well, I mean, it only had a fighting chance. The point still stands. It only had a fighting chance even getting out the gate, even getting into production by selling Stephen King down the river, and that's exactly what they did. But I'd like to hear. I obviously just loved the entire Overlook Hotel sequence because, and I touched on it earlier, just as a very unintentional and entertaining vandalism of a classic property. But what did you think about it?
There's a bit in this film where Mac the lad walks past the elevator, the spewing blood.
Yes.
And it was like, you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of like Scary Movie 1 or 2, because that scene means so much, even to me who isn't the biggest fan of The Shining. That scene is so iconic and means so much, and it means absolutely nothing to that character, and they just walk on by, because of course they do. And I would love like Shorty from those like Scary Movie films seeing that and being like, well, that was fucking weird, and just walking off.
Yeah, actually, it was like a spoof.
You couldn't write it funnier. Like, it was actually hilarious, and I didn't laugh because I felt really bad for the people who were clearly quite engaged with this film. And this is why, when I look at these people saying that it's like a worthy successor, or that this is like a completion of like what might be one of their favorite horror sagas, it's like, what fucking film were you watching, or how low is your? Do you just need to see something you recognize?
Yeah.
Because also those two shots weren't shot. She was not looking at blood. Like, that was so apparent that actress wasn't looking at that blood.
Yeah.
They were like, look amused into the camera and we'll juxtapose it with the blood.
Point of her presence in the Overlook Hotel was to put her in a dangerous situation where there were supernatural powers that even she couldn't handle. So it really fucking punked the movie that they had her walk up and then they did the elevator doors opening and the blood coming out, and she looked at it like a cat had just walked into the hallway and done a shit.
Yeah.
She just walked by. It was like
disdain.
It was like in The Simpsons where they're laughing at the house because it can't make the walls bleed. It was a spoof.
By including these and by trying to show respect for The Shining, which I believe they were trying to do, unless they were actually just cashing in which case I guess it makes complete sense. They completely shat on so many of its legacies. Like, when I watched The Shining, and when I watch the elevator scene now, I'm not going to think of anything except the Mac lads, like, looking at it as it fucking spews towards her and she walks away.
When they were running around, when the psychic little girl was running around the hotel and looking at all the things and the spots and all of the things were happening that you remember, and it was like the house was like, yeah, motherfuckers, I'm back. And it was goofy. And
it was so goofy.
Danny like unleashed all of the ghosts from The Shining as attack dogs on her. It was funny. It was like some kind of, I don't even know, like a resolution to a... Yeah, like fan fiction or a resolution to like a Saturday morning cartoon. I was giddy. It was, and when he gets... It's so convenient. It was like perfect. It was a parody of all of these sequels, that come this far later and try and reboot. The axe gets him in the leg, and then he's holding the axe and running around the mansion.
Limping.
Just like his dad. Yeah, limping
so
just
dumb.
like Jack Torrance. If I thought for a second that this would affect the way that I watched The Shining, then I would find it awful. But luckily, I'm just gonna... It's just a weird thing that happened in October, man.
We've always had this split where I can't separate any pieces of canon and you can, and I think that's good. I think it's nice to have differences, and like I said, I envy you in a way that you probably like find me quite amusing.
Yes.
But I feel that and again, I don't want to be melodramatic here. Like, I will watch The Shining and I'm sure I'll enjoy it, but I will never now not think of so many dumbass things in this film, and that's upsetting. And again, just all the mystique is gone to me. Like, everything about that hotel, everything about those ghosts. And again, I do think the core of this comes down to one director who doesn't believe in God and one writer who does, and one director who believes that things should be implied and one writer who believes things should be explained. And I think when that is those are the your two core guiding philosophies, and they're both responsible for making a film, like no wonder it's fucking mad, and not mad in like a good way.
And here he came to fucking settle the score against a dead man who couldn't fight back.
Yeah, exactly. But an infinitely more prestigious dead man.
That sums up Doctor Sleep in the best way possible, and that's what I'm recommending people go and see. I recommend they go and see this kind of unwinnable fight between two irreconcilable visions for a sort of similar story, and it didn't annoy me. I just thought it was amazing.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And like I said, I can't say I'm happy that it exists this time. However, because it does, and because much like Kubrick, I agree life is imperfect. I think it's worth consideration, and it's interesting again, like purely from a creator's point of view. If you're interested in what two very different people who are both very well respected in, well, it pains me to say Stephen King is well respected, but he is essentially. Watch them duke it out for a schlocky horror novella from the 80s. Good fun.
We've been checked for traps.
Yeah,
Go see the movie.